The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above the rows of weapon racks, their sterile glow reflecting off polished barrels and oiled bolts. The armory at Fort Bragg wasn't glamorous, but to Samantha Torres, it was a cathedral of steel and precision. Every rifle had its place, every pistol its serial number, every magazine its record. The other soldiers might grumble about paperwork, but Samantha thrived on the order of it, while others dreamed of adrenaline-filled missions and battlefield glory. Samantha found satisfaction in the quiet details most overlooked. She checked firing pins the way an artist examined a brush, ensuring each piece was clean, aligned, and capable of firing when called upon. Soldiers rotated in and out, some barely noticing her as more than the clerk behind the counter. But every weapon they carried had passed through her hands, touched by her quiet diligence. Most people assumed she was just another paper pusher in uniform. What they didn't know, what she never offered, was that her familiarity with firearms ran deeper than an armory logbook. Long before she wore fatigues, she had spent her childhood on a patch of stubborn Texas land where rifles were not accessories but lifelines. Her father had been a rancher, lean and weathered by sun and wind, with calloused hands that seemed carved from the same earth he tilled. He taught Samantha to shoot almost as soon as she could steady a rifle on her. Small shoulder. Out here, he told her, you don't miss, because missing means you go hungry. He showed her how to gauge wind by watching grass, how to count heartbeats before pulling the trigger, and how patience was more important than speed. By age 12, she could drop a coyote at 400 yards before it reached the livestock. By 16, she was making shots most hunters twice her age wouldn't even attempt. It wasn't about bragging. Her father would have cuffed her ear for boasting. It was about necessity. You learned to hit your mark, or you lost what you needed. That upbringing shaped her more than she realized. When her parents' ranch fell on hard times and college felt out of reach, the army seemed like a steady path. She signed up, not for the thrill of combat, but for stability. When she was placed in the armory role, she accepted it without complaint. Some soldiers sneered at the assignment, seeing it as a dead end. Samantha only saw a responsibility, a place where her skill for detail mattered. Every day was a rhythm, the clack of rifle bolts sliding open for inspection, the sharp scent of CLP oil, the echo of boots against concrete floors. She logged weapons in and out, eyes scanning serials faster than most soldiers could read them aloud. Occasionally, she'd pause to adjust a sight someone had mounted crooked or quietly correct a sloppy cleaning job. She rarely explained herself, but those who received their weapons from her noticed they always performed flawlessly in the field. Still, she was invisible. Operators, infantrymen, even junior officers often glanced right through her. In their eyes, she was support, not a warrior. She didn't mind, at least not outwardly. But sometimes, in the stillness after lights out, she felt the weight of being underestimated. There were moments when she wanted to speak up, to tell the cocky sergeant boasting about his 700-yard shot that she had once dropped a feral hog clean at nearly double that distance. But pride was dangerous, and Samantha had learned long ago that silence earned more than bravado. Instead, she found her own rhythm outside duty hours. While others hit the gym, she spent quiet evenings at the base range, checking out leftover ammunition and practicing with whatever rifle was available. She never drew a crowd, never boasted, but her groups were tight, her breathing steady. A range officer once noticed and asked if she'd ever considered sniper school. She had shrugged, deflecting. "Not my lane, sir." The idea lingered in her mind, but she knew the army machine wasn't built to notice clerks who kept their heads down. What struck most people, if they bothered to pay attention, was her patience. She could stand still for long stretches, adjusting a rifle sight by the smallest fraction until it was just right. That patience wasn't flashy. It didn't get her medals, but it had been burned into her bones on quiet Texas nights, waiting for deer to step into the clearing, waiting for wind to still, waiting until her heartbeat and the earth's rhythm aligned before the shot. That patience, though unrecognized, set her apart. It was on one of those unremarkable afternoons in the armory, rows of rifles gleaming, forms stacked neatly, that the spark of change appeared. Special Forces operators had returned from the field, dropping weapons on counters with the casual clatter of men too tired to care about protocol. Samantha moved behind them like a shadow, collecting cereals, checking bolts, marking her logs. She didn't mind their noise. These men lived at the tip of the spear, their world a constant churn of adrenaline and precision. She respected them, but she knew her place. Among them was Sergeant First Class Mark Daniels. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had seen and survived more than most. His rifle, a custom long-range beast, was the kind of weapon few ever touched. Samantha noted the balance instinctively when he set it down. The polished scope, the slight wear marks that suggested thousands of rounds fired at impossible distances. The men swapped jokes, talking about shots they'd taken and misses they wouldn't admit in official reports. Daniels mentioned a recent training session at extreme range, dismissing with a laugh how even seasoned snipers struggled past 2,000 meters. Someone asked what the longest possible hit was, and Daniels casually dropped a number. 3,800 meters. That's pushing physics, boys. You can barely see that far, let alone hit. Samantha said nothing at first. But as she moved down the line of rifles, she couldn't help remembering a winter morning back home. She'd been 17, a feral hog threatening the herd, and she'd taken the shot at nearly 1,200 yards across a frost-covered field. She hadn't missed. It wasn't 3,000 meters, not even close, but it had been farther than most would ever try. Without realizing it, she'd muttered under her breath, "That's not impossible." The words slipped out like a breath of wind, but Daniels caught them. His head snapped toward her, eyebrow raised. "What's that? Torres?" Heat flushed her face, but her voice stayed steady. "I said it's not impossible, just unlikely." The room chuckled, soldiers elbowing each other. Daniel smirked, eyes narrowing as though weighing her. "Unlikely? You ever shot past 2 miles, Specialist?" "No," she admitted evenly. "But long shots don't scare me." The laughter grew louder, filling the room with disbelief. Daniels leaned forward, grinning like a wolf who'd scented prey. "Tell you what, bet you can't even scratch steel at 3,800. You up for that?" Samantha looked at him, then at the rifle resting on the counter. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The silence stretched, her eyes locked on his, unflinching. The chuckles quieted just enough for everyone to feel the shift. That was the moment the bet was born. The moment the armory clerk stopped being invisible. And, though no one realized it yet, that quiet spark was about to grow into a fire that would leave an entire unit questioning everything they thought they knew about the woman in the armory. The room seemed to hold its breath after Daniel's words. Soldiers milled about, returning rifles, chatting, laughing, but their ears were tuned to the exchange at the counter. Daniels leaned casually against the steel surface, arms crossed, his grin daring her to reply. Samantha stood steady behind the armory desk, pen poised over the logbook. She could have laughed it off, could have said she was joking, or that she knew her place. That would have been the safer choice. But the silence stretched, and she realized every man in the room was waiting for her answer. Her father's voice drifted back to her memory, gravelly with age and pride. "Ever say you can't until you've tried. The land that don't forgive." "Doubt," Samantha cleared her throat, her words soft but firm. "If the rifle's good enough, I'll take the shot." A ripple of laughter, exploded across the room. Some clapped their buddies on the shoulder, shaking their heads at the audacity. A few looked almost uncomfortable, like they just witnessed someone stepping far out of line. Daniels didn't laugh. He just smiled wider, the kind of smile that said he'd found entertainment for the week. "Is that so?" he said slowly. "You've been hiding a sniper's badge back there behind that desk, Specialist?" "No, Sergeant," she said evenly, "but I know how to shoot." That earned another chorus of chuckles. Daniels glanced at his team, then back at her. "All right then, 7 days. We'll take you to the long-range pit. 3,800 meters. If you hit, I'll buy the whole damn unit steak. If you don't," he paused, savoring the suspense, "you clean our rifles for a month. Every last one." More laughter. Someone in the back shouted, "She's gonna regret that real quick." Samantha wrote another serial number into the logbook, her hand steady. She didn't look at Daniels. "Fine, but I'll need your rifle." That stopped him for just a moment. The grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise. Then he chuckled. "My rifle, huh? You think you can just pick up a .416 Barrett and start ringing steel at 2 miles like it's a squirrel hunt?" She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "If it's your bet, it should be your rifle." The room went still for half a heartbeat. Daniels studied her, as though trying to decide whether she was brave, stupid, or both. Then he slapped the counter with his palm. "Deal." The crowd erupted again, half mocking, half impressed with her nerve. That night, the whispers spread across Fort Bragg like wildfire. Soldiers swapped the story in the mess hall, in the barracks, at the gym. The armory clerk was going to take on a sniper shot. Some thought it was hilarious. Some pitied her for being set up, but others felt a strange itch of curiosity. Samantha kept her head down. She didn't tell anyone what had happened, didn't brag or deny. She just followed her usual rhythm. Logbooks, inspections, racks of rifles. But she felt the stares now. Sideways glances, smirks from soldiers who thought they knew how the story would end. That night in her bunk, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the barracks ventilation. Pride battled humility in her chest. She hadn't meant to speak out. The words had just slipped, rising from some deep place inside her that bristled at being underestimated. And now she was committed. She turned over, her mind spinning. She pictured the target, a speck of steel on the horizon, heat waves blurring it into nothing. She thought about wind, about bullet drop, about a 2-mile distance that turned even the best shooters into gamblers. She could lose. No, she would almost certainly lose. But something inside her whispered that wasn't the point. 3 days. Later, Daniels appeared at the armory again. He leaned casually against the counter, his rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes twinkling with mischief. "You still in, Torres? Haven't lost your nerve?" Samantha kept working, her hands busy, with inspection tags. "Still in," he chuckled. "Good. The boys are looking forward to the show." She didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she asked, "You zero your rifle at that range?" That stopped him for a second. "Zero at 3,800? He laughed. "You don't zero at that distance. You adjust. Dial the scope, factor the wind, pray to whatever god you believe in." Samantha nodded slowly, filing that away. She had never fired at such an impossible range, but she understood. The language. Her father had taught her that even the tiniest change mattered. Half an inch at 100 yards became feet at 1,000. At 3,800, it was like threading a needle blindfolded in a storm. The night before the challenge, Samantha walked the quiet length of the base range after hours. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder, the ground littered with spent brass that glinted in the moonlight. She carried no rifle, no gear, just herself. She knelt at the firing line and looked across the expanse. It was only 800 yards to the far berm, but in her mind she stretched it further, imagining the steel target that waited 2 miles away. She breathed slow, steady, timing her inhalations with the rhythm of her heart. She imagined the recoil, the long silence after the trigger pull, and the faint metallic ping that might never come. Her hands didn't shake. That surprised her. Instead, there was a calmness, the same calm she'd felt in Texas fields, the calm that came before the shot that mattered. By the time the 7th day arrived, anticipation had built like a storm cloud. A crowd gathered at the long-range pit, operators, infantry, even a few officers, curious to see the spectacle. Soldiers perched on tailgates, leaned against Humvees, and cracked jokes about side bets. Daniels stood at the front, rifle case open on the table. His Barrett glinted in the morning sun, long and heavy, its scope like a telescope meant to reach the moon. He handled it with the reverence of a priest with his holy book. When Samantha arrived, the murmurs rippled through the crowd. She carried nothing but a water bottle and her steady walk. No bravado, no showmanship, just the quiet figure from the Armory, stepping into a world that didn't belong to her. Daniel smirked. "Glad you showed. I was half afraid you'd back out." Samantha looked at the rifle, then at him. "I said I'd try." "I'll try." The crowd leaned in, hungry for the drama. What no one realized, not Daniels, not the operators, not the officers, was that this wasn't just about pride for Samantha. It wasn't about winning a bet or silencing laughter. For her, it was about proving that quiet skill mattered. That unseen strength had a place in a world that only respected loud victories. She didn't expect to win, but she did expect to try harder than anyone thought she could. And when she settled behind that rifle, the weight of it pressing into her shoulder, the world would discover that the woman they overlooked in the Armory had been forged long before any of them ever noticed her. The bet spread faster than wildfire. Within 2 days, nearly everyone on Fort Bragg knew about it. The quiet woman in the Armory was going to attempt a sniper shot at 3,800 meters. Soldiers repeated it with disbelief, with laughter, with curiosity. Some swore she'd choke before she even picked up the rifle. Others wondered why she had agreed at all. To Samantha, the sudden attention felt suffocating. She was used to blending into the background, to doing her work with steady hands and leaving without anyone remembering her face. Now, every hallway carried whispers. Every mess hall table carried side bets. The Armory was no longer just her domain. It was a stage where soldiers came in just to sneak glances at the sniper clerk. She wanted to retreat, to bury herself in silence until the whole thing passed. But the commitment had been spoken aloud, and there was no unringing that bell. She had accepted Daniel's challenge in front of witnesses, and now the entire base seemed determined to see her either rise or fall. That evening, sitting alone in her bunk, she felt the weight of what she had stepped into. She ran her fingers across her calloused palms, remembering the years of steady grips, of holding rifles until they felt like extensions of her body. But never, not once, had she fired at anything beyond a mile. The sheer physics of the shot loomed in her mind. Bullet drop, wind drift, air density, all multiplied across the impossible distance until luck seemed more important than skill. What was I thinking? She asked herself in the quiet. Her roommate, a chatterbox from logistics, noticed the change in her. "You're awfully quiet these days," she teased. "You nervous about that bet?" "Heard the guys are planning a barbecue for after you miss." Samantha forced a small smile. "Something like that." She didn't explain further. She never did. The next morning, she went to the range. Not the long-distance pit where the challenge would happen, but the standard rifle range where soldiers drilled weekly. She checked out a standard M2010 sniper rifle, the closest she could get, her hands on without raising eyebrows. The range officer gave her a curious look, but said nothing. Settling prone on the mat, Samantha pressed her cheek against the stock. The world narrowed into scope and target, wind and breath. She fired, adjusted, fired again. The groups tightened, the rhythm returning like muscle memory. But the target was only 800 yards away, a fraction of what awaited her. She spent hours like that, in silence, the barrel warming beneath her cheek. Other soldiers came and went, muttering to each other about the Armory girl practicing for the circus. Samantha ignored them. She wasn't trying to impress anyone here. She was trying to listen to the wind, to her breathing, to the subtle shifts her body made when fatigue set in. By afternoon, her shoulder was sore, but her mind was calmer. The doubts didn't disappear, but they began to feel less like weights and more like sparks, each one pushing her to focus harder. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed to enjoy the growing spectacle. Word reached Samantha that he had been seen in the mess hall, spinning the story like a showman. "She doesn't stand a chance," he'd laugh, shaking his head. "I've seen trained snipers blow it at that distance. And she thinks she's going to walk in from the armory and outshoot us? Please." But what surprised Samantha was that not everyone agreed with him. A few voices, quiet, almost cautious, began to speak in her defense. "I don't know, man," one soldier said. "You ever watch her at the range? She doesn't miss." Another muttered, "She's different. Doesn't flap her mouth like the rest of us. Just does the work." The base began to split into two camps, those who waited for her to fail, and those who secretly hoped she'd shock them all. On the fourth night after the bet, Samantha pulled out a notebook she hadn't touched in years. It was old, leather-bound, the kind her father had given her before she shipped off to basic. Inside were sketches and scribbles, bullet trajectories. She had calculated in high school, wind charts she had copied from hunting magazines, notes her father had dictated about patience and breathing. She traced the faded ink with her fingers, remembering his voice. "A shot is a conversation between you and the world, Sam. You don't force it. You listen." Her throat tightened. He had passed before he could ever see her in uniform, but she felt him now, in every note, every faded line. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine not just failing, but succeeding. Could she? Could she really? The week wore on, and Samantha continued her quiet preparation. She didn't have access to a .416 Barrett, nor to the ballistic calculators the snipers used, but she had her instincts. She spent evenings lying flat in her barracks room, practicing her breathing until her chest barely rose, timing the beat of her heart to an invisible trigger squeeze. She studied wind, not just on the range, but in the rustle of trees, the swirl of dust across asphalt, the shift of flags on poles. Her world narrowed into observation. Every small detail became practice. By the sixth day, she had found a kind of peace. She wasn't confident, not in the arrogant sense, but she was steady. And that steadiness was something the others underestimated. The night before the attempt, Daniels himself came to the armory. He placed his rifle on the counter, opening the case with a kind of ceremony. The Barrett gleamed under the fluorescent lights, long and sleek, the scope mounted like an eye that could pierce horizons. Samantha looked at it without speaking. Daniel smirked. "That's the tool you'll be working with tomorrow. She kicks harder than what you're used to. Heavy trigger, but smooth. Scope's dialed. Think you can handle her?" Samantha met his gaze. "I'll try." "Try won't cut it," Daniel said, his voice almost serious for the first time. "That range eats people alive. Don't embarrass yourself." She didn't reply. She simply signed the temporary log for inspection and handed the case back. Daniel studied her a moment longer, then shook his head and laughed softly. "You're something else, Torres. Can't figure out if you're brave or crazy." That night, Samantha didn't sleep much. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the murmurs of soldiers in the barracks halls. She knew tomorrow the crowd would gather, eager to watch her rise or fall. She knew Daniels expected to laugh, the others expected to cheer, and most expected nothing more than a spectacle. But for her, it wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't even about Daniels. It was about the girl from Texas who had once stared across a frosted field, finger on a trigger, knowing the shot mattered more than anything. It was about her father's voice, telling her that patience and steadiness were worth more than bravado. It was about proving to herself that she was more than the quiet clerk behind the counter. As the hours stretched into dawn, Samantha closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Listen. Don't force it. Listen." Tomorrow she would face the shot, and whatever happened, she would meet it steady. The morning of the challenge dawned crisp and clear. The sky in endless blue stretched across Fort Bragg like a stage curtain waiting to be pulled. Soldiers drifted toward the long-range pit in groups, their voices carrying across the cool air. It wasn't every day an Armory clerk challenged a decorated sniper, or perhaps, more accurately, allowed herself to be challenged. The story had grown in retelling. Some swore Samantha had bragged about taking impossible shots. Others claimed Daniels had baited her until she snapped. Whatever the truth, the spectacle was set. From her barracks window, Samantha watched the first trucks roll past toward the range. She dressed with quiet precision, tugging her boots tight, her fingers steady, though her chest carried the hum of tension. She carried nothing in her hands. No gear, no weapon, nothing to suggest she belonged among the snipers. Only her water bottle and her silence. As she walked, soldiers along the way gave her sidelong glances. Some smirked. Others raised their brows, as if surprised she hadn't backed out. A few even muttered encouragement, low enough to be missed if not for her sharp ears. She didn't answer. Her boots struck the pavement in measured rhythm, her eyes forward. The long-range pit sprawled out before her when she arrived, a vast stretch of sand and scrub, heat waves already shimmering above the earth, though the sun was still climbing. At the far horizon, nearly invisible without optics, the faint silhouette of the steel target waited like a dare. A crowd of at least 50 had gathered, soldiers perched on tailgates, leaning on Humvees, some with coffee cups, others already placing side bets. The air buzzed with the kind of energy usually reserved for fights or sports games. At the center of it all, Sergeant First Class Mark Daniels stood beside a folding table. His Barrett rifle rested there like a relic, its long barrel catching the sunlight, the massive scope gleaming with menace. He spotted Samantha instantly and grinned, raising his voice. "Look who showed up. Thought you might have lost your nerve, Torres." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Samantha didn't flinch. She walked straight to the table, her eyes on the rifle, not the faces. "I said I'd try," she answered evenly. Daniels lifted the case lid the rest of the way, as if presenting a crown jewel. "This beauty's zeroed in 1,000. Past that, you'll be on your own. She'll buck hard, so don't whine about the recoil. You ready?" Samantha studied the weapon. She had seen Barrett rifles before, but never this close, never this custom. The .416 caliber rounded chambered was a monster sleek, heavy, designed to punch across impossible distances. The rifle itself was almost art, long lines, matte finish, bipod steady as stone. It radiated precision, danger, and power. She ran a hand lightly along the stock, testing its balance, the way her father had taught her to always know a rifle. By feel before trusting it. Daniels raised an eyebrow at the gesture, smirk still plastered on his face, but there was the faintest flicker of curiosity in his eyes. The crowd pressed closer. A junior soldier muttered, "She looks like she's never even held one." Another answered, "Just wait. She'll crack on the first shot." Samantha ignored them. She knelt slowly, settling prone behind the rifle, cheek pressing against the stock. The world around her seemed to hush, the noise of the crowd fading, until all she could hear was her own breath and the faint rustle of grass in the breeze. Her father's voice whispered through memory, "The rifle's an old friend, Sam. Treat it that way. Don't fight it. Listen." She adjusted the bipod, shifted her body until her spine aligned straight, her shoulders squared. She looked through the scope, and the earth seemed to stretch forever. Heat shimmer blurred the horizon, and the steel target was no more than a suggestion, a pale rectangle in a sea of wavering air. For a moment, doubt punched through her. "Calm. This is insane. It's too far. You don't belong here." Then she inhaled, slow and deep, and let the thought drift away. Belonging wasn't the point. Trying was. Daniels crouched beside her, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "All right, Torres. Safety's off. 10 rounds. Let's see if you can even touch dirt near that plate." The crowd chuckled again, soldiers leaning forward, eager to witness the inevitable miss. Samantha closed her eyes briefly. She felt the weight of the rifle, the press of the earth against her chest, the rise and fall of her breath. She remembered lying in Texas fields as a girl, frost crunching beneath her belly, waiting for a feral hog to step clear. She remembered the stillness, the patience, the moment the world narrowed to heartbeat and trigger. Her eyes opened, clear and sharp. She wrapped her hand around the grip, finger resting just outside the trigger guard. She wasn't thinking about Daniels anymore, or the crowd, or even the distance. She was thinking about the conversation her bullet was about to have with the wind, the air, the earth. And in that silence, as the entire crowd seemed to lean closer, Samantha Torres prepared to fire the first shot of her life that everyone would remember. The world held its breath. Samantha lay prone, the Barrett pressed against her shoulder, the steel target at 3,800 meters, little more than a shimmering blur in her scope. She took a slow breath, exhaled, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a kick from a mule, forcing her body to rock back against the mat. She gritted her teeth, but didn't let the movement shake her concentration. Her eyes stayed fixed through the scope, following the trace of the bullet as far as she could before it disappeared into the mirage. A long pause. Then, nothing. No sound, no ping, no dust near the target. The crowd burst into laughter. "She didn't even hit dirt," someone jeered. Another soldier doubled over, clutching his knees. Daniels chuckled beside her, his voice carrying loud enough for everyone to hear. "About 100 yards short and 50 wide. Don't worry, Torres. Happens to the best of us." "Well," he grinned, "the rest of us?" More laughter. Samantha adjusted her position, her face calm. She shifted the rifle slightly, her hand steady on the scope's elevation turret. She didn't answer Daniels, didn't flinch at the ridicule. She just listened. The sound of his correction wasn't mockery to her. It was data. She chambered the second round. Again she breathed, slow, steady. Again the rifle thundered. This time, dust kicked up closer to the target, though still well off. Murmurs spread through the crowd. She was adjusting, learning. Daniels crouched, his grin faltering slightly as he studied the splash of dirt through his own spotting scope. "Better, but the wind's not your friend today." He tapped the side of his head. "You gotta read it. Feel it." Samantha said nothing. She let his words settle as she pulled the bolt, feeling the rhythm of the weapon. The recoil was harsh, but she was beginning to anticipate it, to ride it instead of fighting it. She remembered Texas mornings when her father would set up tin cans at distances she thought impossible. He'd stand back with arms folded, watching her miss again and again until finally she learned to adjust not by numbers, but by instinct. "You're not just shooting at the can," he'd told her. "You're shooting through the air, through the wind, through everything between you and it. Listen to all of it." The third shot rang out. Another plume of dust, closer still. The laughter dimmed into murmurs, the tone shifting from amusement to curiosity. Daniels lowered his scope, his smirk softening. "All right, Torres, you're walking it in. But luck runs out fast at 2 miles. By the 5th round, the crowd had gone quieter. Soldiers leaned forward, shielding their eyes against the sun, as though that would help them see better. Each shot carried a weight of suspense. The thunder of the Barrett, the long silence as the bullet arced unseen across the sky, the breathless wait for some sign near the target. Samantha adjusted in tiny increments, her fingers precise on the dials, her breathing a steady rhythm. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but she welcomed the pain. It told her she was still in control. She wasn't calculating numbers in her head like a sniper might. She wasn't running ballistic formulas. She was watching the wind push heat waves through the scope, listening to the faint rustle of the grass around her, remembering the way dust swirled differently in crosswinds. On her 6th shot, the bullet struck just a few feet off the steel plate, the dirt exploding in a halo around it. Gasps rose from the crowd. "She almost hit it," someone muttered, disbelief lacing their tone. Daniel's jaw tightened, though. He tried to hide it behind a grin. "Close doesn't count, Torres. It's steel or nothing." Samantha reloaded without looking at him. Her face was calm, her eyes sharp. She wasn't chasing approval. She was chasing the rhythm. As she lined up her 7th shot, the noise of the crowd fell away. The world narrowed. She could hear only the wind, see only the wavering shimmer of the target. Her heartbeat slowed, each thud steady in her ears. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett boomed. Time stretched. Soldiers leaned forward, eyes squinting. Daniel stared through his spotting scope, breath held. Then it came, faint but unmistakable. Clang. The steel rang out, the sound carrying back across the pit like a bell. The crowd erupted, gasps and shouts mixing together. Some cheered, some swore, others simply stood frozen. Daniels pulled. Back from the scope, blinking in surprise before masking it with a crooked smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Samantha didn't smile. She simply chambered the next round, her focus unbroken. For her, it wasn't about the cheers or the disbelief. It was about the fact that the conversation between her and the world had finally found its note. And she wasn't finished talking yet. The ringing of steel still echoed faintly across the range when Samantha drew in her next breath. The sound had rolled over the pit like thunder, sharp and undeniable. For a moment, even the wind seemed to pause, as though the world itself had acknowledged what had just happened. Around her, the crowd erupted in a storm of disbelief. Soldiers shouted, some clapping, others swearing under their breath. The tone had shifted from casual amusement to raw astonishment. "Did you hear that?" One soldier cried, grabbing his buddy by the shoulder. "She nailed it. She actually nailed it. No way she does it again," another muttered, though. His voice carried less confidence than before. Samantha lay still, cheek pressed to the stock, her eyes calm. She didn't drink in their cheers, didn't let their astonishment swell her chest. She treated the moment like a sniper treated breath. Between shots, steady, disciplined, fleeting. Daniels, crouched beside her, lowered his spotting scope slowly. His grin wavered, more forced than before, as if he was trying to hold on to a script that no longer fit. "One hit doesn't make a sniper, Torres," he said, loud enough for the audience. "Do it again." She didn't look at him. She only chambered the next round, her hands smooth and methodical. The 8th shot thundered across the field. The Barrett kicked, brass clattered, and the crowd leaned forward. Clang! The steel rang again, clean and sharp. This time, the gasp from the crowd felt almost reverent. It rolled across the pit in a wave, disbelief tipping into awe. "She's doing it," someone whispered. "2 in a row. Holy hell." Daniel's jaw flexed as he studied the distant target through his glass. The hits weren't flukes. Her adjustments weren't wild guesses. She was reading the environment, walking the rounds in with a patience that most rookies lacked. Worse, she was doing it without panic, without the telltale tremors of someone out of their depth. He shifted his stance, masking his unease with another crooked grin. "All right, Torres. Let's see if you can keep the streak alive." Samantha exhaled, slow and measured, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. She wasn't thinking about streaks or proving Daniels wrong. She was thinking about wind currents, about the flicker of heat shimmer in her scope, about the rhythm her body had found with the rifle. Her 9th shot cracked across the pit. Soldiers held their breath. Dust erupted just off the plate's edge. A miss by inches. A groan rippled through the crowd, some jeering again, others shaking their heads. But this time, the laughter lacked conviction. They'd seen what she could do, and the miss didn't erase it. Daniels let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Close," he said, softer this time. Samantha stayed silent. She shifted the scope a fraction, adjusted her cheek weld, and chambered the next round. As she prepared her 10th shot, the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the range. Sweat slid down her temple, but she didn't wipe it away. Her breathing slowed again, her mind narrowing to the tiny world inside the scope. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. The Barrett roared one more time. The long pause stretched. Soldiers leaned forward, eyes wide, silence pressing heavy on the pit. Then, clang, the target rang for the 3rd time. The crowd erupted, louder than before, cheers and shouts rising as if they'd witnessed something historic. Some soldiers threw their caps in the air. Others slapped each other on the back. The pit had transformed into a stadium, and Samantha was at its center. Daniels lowered his scope again, slower this time, his grin gone. His eyes flicked toward her, not with disdain, but with something harder to conceal. Respect, unwilling but real. 3 hits. Out of 10 rounds, at 3,800 meters, from someone who'd never been on the sniper line. He stepped back, folding his arms as if to shield himself from the storm of cheers around him. Samantha rose slowly from the mat, her body aching from the Barrett's repeated punishment. She didn't celebrate, didn't pump her fists or shout. She simply engaged the safety, cleared the chamber, and set the rifle back on its rest. Her expression was calm, composed, but her eyes burned with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had entered the lion's den and walked out unbroken. The crowd surged closer, some clapping her on the back, others shaking their heads in disbelief. "How the hell did you do that?" one soldier asked, eyes wide. "Luck," another muttered, though his tone carried no conviction. Daniels finally stepped forward, raising a hand to silence the noise. His voice carried across the pit, steady but heavier than before. "All right, that's enough. Show's over." Groans and protests rose, but the soldiers began dispersing, still buzzing with excitement. They weren't going to forget what they'd seen. Samantha brushed dirt from her uniform, her movements slow and deliberate. She finally looked at Daniels, her voice low but clear. "You said I couldn't do it." For the first time that day, Daniels didn't have a quick comeback. He studied her for a long moment, then gave the faintest nod. You surprised me, Torres. Not many can say that. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just shouldered her canteen, nodded once, and walked away from the pit, leaving whispers and astonished stares in her wake. She hadn't just hit steel at 2 miles. She'd cracked something deeper, the barrier between armory clerk and soldier, between what people assumed she could do and what she had proven. And though the challenge was over, everyone watching knew one truth as they followed her retreating figure. This was only the beginning. The range had gone quiet, but only on the surface. The moment Samantha left the line, a hum of energy spread through the gathered soldiers, like electricity jumping between live wires. They'd witnessed something so improbable, so out of step, with their understanding of skill and hierarchy, that it seemed half myth already. Groups huddled together, whispering, replaying the shots in animated detail. One soldier used his hands to mimic the booming recoil of the Barrett. Another swore he could still hear the clang of steel ringing in his bones. 3 hits at 3,800 meters, one said, shaking his head in disbelief. She's not even a sniper, another added. Hell, someone else muttered. Maybe she is now. The laughter and jeers from earlier had been erased, swallowed by a collective awe that tasted almost like reverence. Daniels lingered at the edge of the pit, arms crossed, eyes following Samantha as she walked back toward the shade of the armory. Wall. Every instinct in him fought to shrug it off, to dismiss her shots as lucky flukes, but the tight knot in his chest told him otherwise. He'd been in the special forces long enough to recognize when something rare had happened. You didn't. Stack hits like that at 2 miles without a strange blend of instinct and composure. And she'd done it under the weight of his challenge, with an audience breathing down her neck. He ground his teeth, torn between pride and irritation. A part of him wanted to be angry, that his words, meant as a jab, had turned into the very fuel that pushed her forward. But another part, buried deeper, stirred with a grudging respect. Samantha Torres had answered his bet, not with excuses, not with bravado, but with the ringing steel of truth. The soldiers pressed him as the crowd began to break apart. So, Sergeant, you paying up? One grinned, nudging him. Daniels shot the soldier a sharp look. It wasn't money. Still a bet, another. Chimed in. What was it anyway? A private asked. Daniels didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on Samantha, who had taken a seat on a crate by the armory, sipping water in silence. She wasn't laughing, wasn't boasting. She looked more like someone cooling down after a long run than someone who had just shaken the foundations of the range. Finally, Daniels exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. I told her she couldn't do it, and she did. The soldiers erupted in laughter, slapping each other on the back. To them, it was as good as money changing hands. Later, when most of the group had drifted off to chow or back to their duties, Daniels approached Samantha. His boots crunched on the gravel, his shadow stretching across the crate where she sat. You made your point, he said, voice low. She looked up at him, her expression calm. I wasn't trying to. He paused, caught off guard. Then why? Samantha tilted her canteen, watching the water slosh inside. Because you said? I couldn't. And you weren't just talking about the shot. You were talking about me? Daniels didn't reply immediately. Her words landed heavier than the Barrett's recoil. She continued, her tone steady. I'm not here to prove myself to you. Or anyone. I just don't like being told I'm not capable. If I miss, fine. But let me miss on my own terms? Daniels studied her for a long moment. He'd expected arrogance, maybe smugness. What he found instead was a quiet strength that didn't need validation. Finally, he gave a short nod. Fair enough. He extended a hand. Bet settled. Samantha hesitated only a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, hers steady. For the first time that day, there was no mockery between them, only respect, unspoken but solid. Word traveled fast. By evening chow, the mess hall buzzed with chatter. Soldiers leaned across tables, retelling the story to anyone who hadn't been there. You should have seen it, one corporal said, wide-eyed. 7 tries to dial in, then she nails it, clang, 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 like she'd been doing it for years. No way, a private scoffed. Ask anyone who was there. Daniels himself had to eat it. The tale grew with every retelling. By the 3rd version, Samantha had hit 5 in a row. By the 4th, she'd made the shots blindfolded. Exaggerations didn't matter. What mattered was the myth that had started to form. In a place where reputation carried weight, Samantha, Torres had suddenly gone from the Armory girl to the one who'd humbled a Special Forces sniper on his own ground. She felt the shift the next morning. As she walked through the motor pool toward the Armory, soldiers she barely knew nodded in greeting. Some gave her quick salutes. Others clapped her on the shoulder with grins. Hell of a shot, Torres, one said. She offered only a small nod in return. She wasn't chasing their admiration, but she couldn't deny the flicker of pride that warmed her chest. Inside the Armory, she cleaned rifles with the same methodical care as always. Her hands moved with precision, her mind focused. But every so often, she caught someone lingering at the doorway, pretending to need something just to sneak a look at her, the soldier who had done the impossible. Daniels, for his part, kept his distance. But wordlessly, a small shift had occurred between them. When their paths crossed, he no longer smirked or muttered under his breath. Instead, he gave her a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement that she'd earned a place, not just in the Armory, but in the respect of the men who doubted her. And though Samantha never sought it, that respect spread like fire through dry grass. What had begun as a muck-in challenge had become something larger, something that neither Daniels nor Samantha could control. The bet was settled. But the story was only beginning to grow. By the end of the week, the shot had traveled farther than the bullet ever could. Samantha Torres' name rippled through the base like a current, whispered in chow lines, repeated during late-night guard shifts, passed between squads gearing up for patrols. At first, it was just the soldiers who had witnessed it firsthand, their voices buzzing with excitement. But then it spread to the ones who hadn't been there, carried on the wings of exaggeration and disbelief until the tale took on a life of its own. 3 hits, 2 miles, against the odds, against expectation. Some swore she had done it effortlessly, calm as a surgeon, while Daniel sweated beside her. Others insisted she had called her shots, predicting the clang before the bullet ever touched steel. The details grew distorted, but the core remained the same. The girl from the Armory had taken the sniper's bet and won. For Samantha, little had changed in her day-to-day routine. She still unlocked the Armory at dawn, still logged equipment with the same steady hand, still scrubbed grease from rifles until the metal gleamed. But the way people looked at her was different. Soldiers who once walked past her without a word now offered nods of respect, or stopped to ask questions about ballistics, scopes, or wind calls, subjects she'd never studied formally, but spoke about with a natural intuition. She answered simply, without embellishment. If she didn't know, she admitted it. If she had a guess, she shared it humbly. She never leaned into the myth that others were building around her. She let the story run its course while she remained grounded. Daniels avoided the chatter. He didn't correct the rumors, didn't add fuel to the fire, but neither did he try to tear them down. Something inside him had shifted the moment her 3rd round rang steel. He'd seen arrogance ruin good soldiers before, and he recognized now that Samantha's silence, her lack of hunger for glory, was what made the feat so remarkable. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, he found her cleaning a rifle outside the armory. The Barrett leaned against the wall beside her, already spotless from her meticulous care. "You could have let them celebrate you," he said, breaking the quiet. She looked up, arching an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because." Most would have cashed in, gotten themselves a reputation, maybe a seat at the sniper line. Samantha wiped the bolt carrier, setting it aside neatly. "Reputations don't keep rifles clean. And I don't want to be on the sniper line. I just wanted to show that I could." Daniel studied her a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Fair enough, but if you ever change your mind, there's a place for someone with your instincts. People like you don't come around often." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Instincts don't make me a sniper. You know that. What I did was luck and rhythm, nothing more." Daniels didn't argue. He only said, "Luck doesn't stack 3 hits at 3,800 meters. Then he walked away, leaving her, with the quiet hum of twilight and the weight of his words. As weeks passed, the legend didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. New arrivals to the base heard it as one of the first stories whispered in the barracks, like a campfire tale passed down through generations. "You know Torres? Armory specialist? She hit at 2 miles. Ask anyone." Some didn't believe it. Until they saw her, quiet and unassuming, the last person they expected to be the subject of such a story. That only made the tale richer, more improbable. And sometimes, on quiet nights, soldiers would drift by the long-range pit, staring at the distant steel plate, barely visible against the horizon. They'd shake their heads, murmuring about how impossible it looked, how the wind seemed to laugh at the idea of a bullet flying true across that distance. Then they'd say her name again, as though speaking it kept the possibility alive. For Samantha, the weight of the story was both strange and humbling. She never set out to be a symbol. She had only wanted to prove, to herself and to Daniels, that being underestimated didn't mean being incapable. But now, younger soldiers, privates and specialists just like she once was, sought her out not for gossip, but for reassurance. They'd sit with her in the armory, nervous about qualifying with their rifles or doubting their place in the uniform, and she'd remind them with simple words, "Don't let someone else decide what you can't do." It wasn't about shooting steel at 2 miles. It was about pushing back when someone drew limits around you. One afternoon, weeks after the bet had settled, Samantha stood again at the pit. Not with a rifle this time. She'd refused every offer to repeat the feat, but just looking out across the distance. The wind tugged at her sleeves, carrying the same restless currents she'd once read through a scope. Behind her, Daniels approached. He said nothing at first, just stood with her, both of them staring at the speck of steel far, far away. "Funny thing about legends," he said at last. "They always start with someone who wasn't supposed to." Samantha didn't reply. Right away, her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, calm and steady. Then she said, "Legends aren't the point. Doing it once was enough. I don't need more than that." Daniels chuckled, low and genuine. "That's why it stuck. That's why they'll keep telling it." And they did. Long after the dust of that day settled, long after the echoes of her shots faded, the story of Samantha Torres continued to ripple through the ranks. It was retold in training camps to motivate recruits. It was whispered in overseas deployments to spark courage before missions. Some versions grew outrageous, others stripped down to the simple truth. But no matter how it changed, the heart of it remained. She was only in the armory until a Special Forces sniper bet she couldn't hit 3,800 meters. And she proved she could. Samantha herself never sought to correct or embellish the tale. She lived her days much as she always had, diligent, humble, steady. But somewhere deep inside, where the world grew quiet and only the memory of the Barrett's roar remained, she carried the knowledge that she had reached beyond expectation. And sometimes, late at night, when soldiers spoke her name as though it belonged to a legend rather than a person, Samantha would smile to herself in the dark, knowing the truth they could never fully grasp. It hadn't been about the shot. It had been about defying the limits set for her. And that was a target she would never stop hitting.